The First Buddhist Council and the fear of losing the teachings forever. In the quiet that follows the passing of someone who has shaped our inner life, there is often a strange and fragile feeling that settles in the chest. It is not only grief for the person who is gone, but a deeper unease, a sense that something precious has been loosened from the world and may now drift away if no one is careful enough to hold it. This fear does not announce itself loudly. It moves softly, like a question we are afraid to ask. What if what we have been given does not survive us, or even survive this moment? Human history is filled with such pauses. After a teacher dies, after a generation passes, after a voice that once guided many falls silent. Those who remain must face impermanence, not as an abstract idea, but as an immediate responsibility. Memory becomes fragile, meaning feels exposed. Even truth, which once seemed steady, begins to feel vulnerable. It is in these moments that people realize how easily wisdom can be lost, not through destruction, but through neglects, misunderstanding, or the slow erosion of attention. Not long after the Buddha's death, his followers stood in precisely this space of uncertainty. The one who had walked among them, spoken plainly, corrected gently, and lived as a visible embodiment of the path, was no longer there to answer questions or clarify doubts. What remained were human beings with fallible memories, strong emotions, differing temperaments, and a shared concern that the clarity they had received might fade into distortion or silence. The fear was not dramatic or despairing, but sober and deeply human. Without careful effort, the teachings could scatter like ashes in the wind. This moment, often referred to as the First Buddhist Council, is sometimes spoken of as a historical event, but at its heart it is an intimate human story. It is the story of people realizing that truth does not preserve itself automatically. It must be remembered, spoken, lived, and protected, not through force but through care. The same quiet fear that stirred among those early practitioners still moves within us today whenever we sense that something essential is at risk of being forgotten. In the days following the Buddha's passing, the community he left behind did not immediately fracture into chaos or despair. Instead, something quieter and more complex unfolded. There was mourning, certainly, but there was also an undercurrent of alertness, a recognition that a threshold had been crossed. The teachings had always been alive in the presence of the Buddha himself. His voice, his conduct, and his responses to circumstance acted as a living reference point. With that presence gone, the teachings were suddenly exposed to time in a new way. They were no longer sheltered by immediacy. They had to survive memory, repetition, and human care. The monks who had lived closest to the Buddha understood this instinctively. They knew that impermanence was not merely a concept to be reflected upon in meditation, but a force that would now test the endurance of the Dharma itself. Words spoken once could be misremembered. Nuances could be lost. Personal interpretations might slowly replace shared understanding. The danger was not malicious distortion, but gradual drift. Truth, when untended, does not usually vanish overnight. It thins out, becomes vague, and eventually feels optional. Among the senior disciples, one figure stood out for his steadiness in this moment. Mahakassapa was known not for eloquence or warmth, but for austerity and clarity. He had practiced with intensity, embracing simplicity and restraint. When he heard of the Buddha's death, his response was not outward collapse, but inward resolve. He saw that grief alone would not safeguard what had been given. Something more deliberate was required. The teachings needed to be gathered, spoken aloud, agreed upon, and entrusted to collective memory before the centrifugal force of time pulled them apart. This was not a bureaucratic impulse, nor an attempt to freeze living insight into rigid form. It arose from a sober understanding of human nature. The early monastic community was diverse. Some were disciplined and contemplative, others energetic and expressive. Some remembered teachings with precision, others through the lens of personal experience. Without a shared effort to listen together and confirm what had been heard, divergence was inevitable. Unity, in this sense, was not about control, but about coherence. The First Council, traditionally said to have taken place in Rajagaha, was convened under this atmosphere of careful urgency. It was not announced with ceremony, nor framed as an act of authority. It was, at its heart, a gathering of listeners. Those present did not claim to create or revise the teachings. They sought instead to recollect them, to let them pass once more through attentive minds and honest voices. The central question was simple yet immense. What did the Buddha actually teach? And how can we ensure that it remains intact? One of the most crucial roles in this process was held by Ananda. He had spent years at the Buddha's side, hearing countless discourses, witnessing subtle interactions, and absorbing the rhythm of the teaching as it unfolded in daily life. Ananda was known for his remarkable memory, but he was also deeply human. He had loved the Buddha dearly, and his grief was fresh. Yet it was precisely his intimacy with the living voice of the Buddha that made his participation essential. When he recited the discourses, he did so not as a performer, but as someone reliving moments of direct encounter. As Ananda spoke, others listened with care. This listening was not passive. It was alert, questioning, and grounded in shared experience. If something sounded unfamiliar or inconsistent, it was examined. Agreement was not assumed. It was earned through resonance and recollection. The process was slow, deliberate, and rooted in trust. It recognized that memory, though fragile, becomes stronger when held collectively and tested gently rather than defended aggressively. Alongside the discourses, attention was also given to the rules of monastic discipline, recited by Upperly. These rules were not mere regulations. They were expressions of a way of life designed to support clarity, restraint, and harmony. To preserve them was to preserve the conditions under which insight could continue to arise. Without discipline, understanding can easily become self-serving. Without shared standards, community quietly erodes. What is striking about this entire endeavor is its humility. No one claimed exclusive ownership of the truth. Authority did not rest on charisma or hierarchy, but on careful remembrance and mutual verification. The teachings were treated not as sacred relics to be locked away, but as living currents that required attentive stewardship. This approach acknowledged both the nobility and the limitation of human faculties. Memory was honored, but never romanticized. Consensus was sought, but not forced. Underlying all of this was a subtle but powerful fear, not of punishment or failure, but of loss. It was the fear that something luminous, once revealed, could be dimmed by inattention. This fear did not paralyze the community. It sharpened it. It encouraged listening over speaking, patience over haste, and humility over assertion. In this way, fear itself became a guardian rather than an enemy. Seen from a distance, the First Council can appear as a formal historical milestone. Seen from within, it was an intimate act of care. It was a group of human beings sitting together, carrying grief, responsibility, and devotion, choosing to respond to impermanence, not with denial, but with mindful action. They did not imagine that they could make the teachings eternal in a fixed sense. They understood that nothing escapes change. What they could do was offer the teachings the best possible chance to endure by rooting them in clarity, repetition, and lived commitment. This moment reveals something enduring about the Buddhist path. Wisdom is not preserved by force of will or by rigid structures alone. It survives through communities willing to listen deeply, question gently, and practice sincerely. The First Council was not an attempt to conquer time. It was an acknowledgement of time's power, and a quiet decision to meet it with care rather than complacency. When we turn from that ancient gathering to our own lives, the distance in time quickly collapses. The fear that moved through the early community is not foreign to us. It appears whenever we sense that something meaningful is slipping through our hands, not because it has been attacked, but because our attention has thinned. We live in an age saturated with information, yet quietly starved of remembrance. Words multiply, but understanding disperses. Teachings are everywhere, but depth feels increasingly rare. The Buddha's followers feared that the teachings might be lost because they were carried only in human memory. We fear something similar, though the conditions are reversed. Today, teachings are stored endlessly in books, recordings, and digital archives, yet their presence in lived experience feels uncertain. Preservation has become external, while embodiment has grown fragile. We remember where information is stored, but not necessarily how it feels to sit with it, to let it challenge us, or to allow it to change the way we live. This raises an uncomfortable question, though it need not be framed as a criticism. What does it actually mean to lose a teaching? Is it lost when texts disappear, or when the inner posture that gives them meaning erodes? The early monks seemed to understand instinctively that words alone were not enough. That is why their recollection was not mechanical. It was relational. It depended on listening, recognition, and shared silence as much as recitation. They were not preserving content alone, but a way of attending to content. In modern life, attention is fragmented in ways the early community could scarcely imagine. We move quickly between tasks, identities, and streams of input. Reflection is often compressed into brief moments between obligations. In such a climate, wisdom does not usually vanish outright. Instead, it becomes thin. Teachings are encountered as ideas rather than as mirrors. They are appreciated intellectually, perhaps even admired, but rarely allowed to unsettle or reorient us. The First Council offers a quiet contrast to this tendency. Its participants did not ask how much could be remembered, but how carefully they could listen. The process was slow, not because they lacked efficiency, but because they valued accuracy of understanding over speed of transmission. This stands in gentle tension with our contemporary habits, where speed is often mistaken for vitality and quantity for depth. We accumulate teachings the way we accumulate possessions, assuming that possession itself is a form of preservation. Yet something essential is lost when teachings are reduced to objects we carry rather than processes we inhabit. The Buddha's path was always experiential. It was concerned with how suffering arises and how it ceases, not as theory, but as lived reality. When the early community gathered to recite what had been taught, they were not merely repeating phrases. They were re-entering a shared field of attention shaped by years of practice. Their agreement was grounded in resonance, not in citation. In our own time, disagreement about teachings often arises not from careful inquiry, but from attachment to identity. We defend interpretations as extensions of ourselves. We argue to win rather than to understand. This is another way teachings can be lost, even when they are loudly discussed. The First Council reminds us that preservation requires humility, a willingness to admit uncertainty, and a commitment to something larger than personal opinion. There is also a quieter parallel that unfolds within individual lives. Each person receives insights at certain moments through experience, reflection, or suffering. These insights can feel vivid and transformative at first, but without care, they fade. The mind returns to familiar patterns. The clarity that once felt obvious becomes distant. In this sense, each of us faces our own version of the First Council. We must decide whether to let insight scatter or to gather it through repetition, reflection, and practice. This gathering does not require formal ceremony. It happens in small acts of remembrance, returning to stillness when restlessness dominates, pausing to feel the body when thought becomes abstract, choosing restraint when impulse feels urgent. These are the ways insight is preserved within a life. Without them, understanding remains episodic, appearing briefly before dissolving back into habit. What makes this parallel especially poignant is that modern culture often rewards the opposite tendencies. We are encouraged to move on quickly, to seek novelty, to treat each moment as replaceable. In such an environment, continuity itself becomes an act of care. To remember deeply, to revisit the same questions again and again, can feel almost subversive. Yet this is precisely what the early community did. They returned to the same teachings, not because they lacked creativity, but because depth reveals itself through repetition. The fear of losing the teachings, when understood properly, is not a fearful clinging to the past. It is an expression of respect for the fragility of understanding. It acknowledges that wisdom does not impose itself on the world. It must be welcomed repeatedly. This fear becomes unwholesome only when it hardens into rigidity or exclusion. In its balanced form, it functions as attentiveness, a reminder not to take clarity for granted. Seen this way, the First Council is less about historical preservation and more about a posture toward truth. It suggests that truth survives best when it is approached with patience, care, and shared responsibility. Not everyone must be a scholar or a teacher, but everyone who touches a teaching becomes, in some small way, a carrier of it. How we speak, how we listen, and how we live all contribute to whether wisdom remains vibrant or becomes hollow. In reflecting on this, we may begin to see that the greatest threat to the teachings has never been external opposition or the passage of time. It has always been subtle forgetting. Forgetting to listen carefully, forgetting to practice what we understand, forgetting that wisdom asks something of us, not in the form of obedience, but in the form of presence. The early community gathered because they sensed this danger. Our task is not so different, even if the setting has changed. As this reflection deepens, another question quietly emerges, one that the First Council seems to ask without ever articulating it directly. What exactly were those monks trying to preserve? If the teachings were only a collection of words, then accurate recitation would have been sufficient, but the care with which they listened, questioned, and confirmed suggests that something more subtle was at stake. They were safeguarding a way of seeing, a mode of attention, and a lived relationship to experience that could not be reduced to language alone. Words, even when remembered perfectly, are incomplete vessels. They point, they suggest, they invite, but they do not contain the fullness of what they indicate. The early community understood this intuitively. The Buddha's teachings had always been responsive to context, shaped by circumstance, and delivered in relation to specific forms of suffering. To preserve them meant preserving their spirit, not freezing their expression. This is why the First Council was not an act of closure, but of continuity. It did not declare the work finished. It acknowledged that the work had to go on without the guiding presence of the teacher. This distinction between form and spirit remains crucial. Throughout history, many traditions have survived in name, while losing their animating insight. They persist as structures, rituals, and texts, yet no longer touch the depths of human suffering or transformation. When this happens, preservation becomes hollow. The teachings are technically intact, but their power to illuminate life has dimmed. The early monks seemed keenly aware of this risk. Their effort was careful precisely because they knew that accuracy without understanding is a fragile achievement. In modern times, the temptation to confuse preservation with repetition is strong. We repeat phrases, concepts, and doctrines, often with great confidence, yet our lives remain largely unchanged. The teachings become familiar rather than challenging. They are admired rather than inhabited. This is another way wisdom can be lost, not through forgetting, but through over-familiarity. When something is too easily accessible, it can be taken lightly. When it asks little of us, it slowly loses its ability to ask anything at all. The First Council stands as a quiet counterexample to this tendency. Its participants did not treat the teachings as possessions, but as responsibilities. They approached them with reverence, not because the words were sacred objects, but because they recognized their transformative potential. To mishandle them was not merely an intellectual error, it was a moral one. It meant risking the dilution of a path that alleviated suffering. This perspective invites a deeper reflection on how teachings live within us. Understanding is not something we acquire once and then store safely away. It is something that must be renewed through practice and attention. Without this renewal, insight becomes memory, and memory becomes nostalgia. The Buddha's followers did not gather to commemorate the past. They gathered to ensure that the path forward remained clear. In this sense, each generation faces a similar task, whether consciously or not. We inherit teachings shaped by the care of those before us, and we either pass them on intact, deepen them through practice, or allow them to erode through neglect. This transmission does not happen only in monasteries or formal settings. It happens in how parents respond to children, how teachers speak to students, how individuals meet their own suffering. The teachings are preserved or lost in these ordinary moments. There is also a personal dimension to this process that mirrors the collective one. Within each person, insights arise that have the potential to reshape a life. These insights often come during moments of vulnerability, stillness, or crisis. At first, they feel undeniable, yet without reinforcement they fade. Old habits reassert themselves. The mind returns to familiar grooves. The insight remains as a faint memory, respected but no longer active. In this way, each person conducts an internal forgetting, not out of malice but out of inattention. The First Council can be read as an invitation to notice this pattern and respond differently. It suggests that care is not something added after understanding, but something integral to it. To understand deeply is to feel responsible. To feel responsible is to act in ways that support continuity. This may look unremarkable from the outside. It may involve returning again and again to the same reflections, practicing patience when impatience feels justified, or choosing restraint when excess is encouraged. Importantly, this form of preservation does not require rigidity. The early community did not attempt to fossilize the teachings. They preserved them precisely so that they could remain alive and responsive. This balance between fidelity and flexibility is delicate. Too much rigidity suffocates insight. Too much looseness dissolves it. The First Council navigated this tension by grounding preservation in collective listening rather than individual authority. Truth was not owned. It was shared. This approach carries an implicit trust in human capacity. It assumes that people, when attentive and sincere, can recognize what resonates with lived experience and what does not. It also assumes that misunderstanding is not a failure to be punished, but a condition to be addressed through dialogue and practice. In an era marked by polarization and certainty, this humility feels especially relevant. The preservation of wisdom depends not on winning arguments, but on sustaining conditions in which understanding can mature. Ultimately, the fear of losing the teachings points beyond the teachings themselves. It points to a deeper concern about losing our capacity to see clearly and respond wisely to suffering. The teachings are precious because they orient us toward this capacity. When they are preserved skillfully, they do not become relics, they remain invitations. When they are neglected or distorted, the loss is not abstract. It shows up in confusion, reactivity, and avoidable pain. The First Council reminds us that wisdom does not survive on its own momentum. It relies on human beings who care enough to listen, remember, and live accordingly. This care does not have to be dramatic. It often expresses itself through quiet consistency. Sitting when restlessness urges escape. Speaking truthfully when exaggeration feels easier. Returning to compassion when resentment feels justified. These are the ways teachings remain alive. In recognizing this, the story of the First Council ceases to belong only to the past. It becomes a mirror held up to the present moment. It asks not whether we admire the teachings, but whether we are willing to become places where they can continue to breathe. When the First Buddhist Council is remembered in this way, it no longer feels like a distant episode preserved in history. It becomes a quiet reflection on how wisdom survives at all. The monks who gathered were not trying to secure immortality for words or doctrines. They were responding to a simple and enduring truth. Understanding is fragile, and without care it fades. Their effort was an act of humility before impermanence, a recognition that even the clearest insight depends on human attention to remain alive. This recognition carries forward into every age. Teachings are never lost all at once. They thin gradually through distraction, through complacency, through the belief that clarity will somehow preserve itself. What keeps them alive is not reverence alone, but relationship. Listening carefully, returning repeatedly, allowing insight to shape conduct rather than merely decorate thought. These are not grand gestures, they are quiet forms of fidelity. Seen from this angle, the fear that motivated the First Council was not a weakness. It was a form of wisdom. It acknowledged that what matters most is easily overlooked, especially when life becomes busy or comfortable. That fear did not turn into clinging. It matured into responsibility, and responsibility, held gently, becomes care. Each person who encounters these teachings stands in a similar place, whether they realize it or not. The question is never only what has been preserved for us, but what we are willing to preserve within ourselves. Attention, patience, compassion, and honesty are not inherited automatically. They are practiced into being. When they are practiced, the teachings remain alive, not as history but as presence. As this reflection comes to rest, there is no need for urgency or instruction. There is only the quiet reminder that wisdom continues wherever someone pauses, listens, and chooses to respond rather than react. If these reflections resonate, you are welcome to remain nearby, returning when the mind grows noisy or the path feels faint. In that simple act of returning, the teachings are already being preserved.